Hello everyone, and welcome to the Inequality and Redistribution, Taxes and Transfers webinar. This is the first in the series called Fiscal Space for Social Protection, Knowledge Sharing Initiative. This initiative is organized by UNDP's International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth and HelpAge International. My name is Raquel Tebaldi, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar. I am a research assistant at the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth, and I work mainly with the socialprotection.org team. Today, our main speaker is Michael Henning. Michael serves as an Economic Affairs Officer in the Fiscal Affairs Unit of the Economic Development Division at ECLAC. Before joining ECLAC in 2012, he served in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva as one of the authors of the World Investment Report. And he currently contributes to ECLAC's flagship publications as well as on research for the organization on topics including fiscal policies and inequality, tax evasion, and tax reforms. He's also an active member of the team that produces the annual revenue statistics in Latin America and the Caribbean, in conjunction with colleagues from OECD, CAET, and DEADB. Our discussant is Rodrigo Octavio Orer. He holds a bachelor's degree with honors in economics from the Federal University of Minas Gerais and a master's degree in economics from the State University of Campinas. He's a researcher for the Institute of Applied Economic Research and for the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth. He's an expert in macroeconomics and public finances, having published many studies on the topics related to public spending and taxing. Okay. And now for a few words on the initiative in general, I'm going to call Daniel Horn. He's the economics advisor for HelpAge International. His work includes a forthcoming publication on the need for a shift in a narrative on how governments perceive demographic aging, as well as field work which investigates the economic multiplier effects of interventions directed for older people. The evolving work of HelpAge International builds on its more than 30 years of expertise in defending the rights for older people, reflecting the emerging focus of methods of adaptive government above reactive resolutions. He has a PhD in political sciences, focus on welfare states and inequality, and a Master of Science in public policy and human development. So Daniel, could you please share a few words about the initiative?
Yes, hello. Good evening or afternoon and or morning, everyone. My name is Daniel, and as just been said, I'm at HelpAge International as the economic advisor for the social protection team. This initiative began sort of the brainstorm following the SPI-IG meeting in November 2015, where it came to light that a lot of the work around social protection was really to look at more of the holistic view of taxes and transfers and not just how we deliver these benefits. And this webinar series is really about addressing those issues. Yeah, I won't say much more, but I hope you really enjoy it. I hope they're informative, and we look forward to a pretty good year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So before we start the main presentation today, I would just like to remind everyone to send your questions via the question area of the application, and please remember to join our Fiscal Space for Social Protection online community at socialprotection.org. So now I'll give the word to Michael to start his presentation.
Thank you very much, Raquel. Thank you very much for organizing this webinar and inviting ECLAC to the event, for letting me share some of the results of our work with you. I'd also like to acknowledge that this work is just one small part of a much broader examination of inequality in all its forms that ECLAC has undertaken over the last 6 years. And if you're interested in this topic, I'd really encourage you all to take a look at ECLAC's Equality Trilogy. Sounds a little bit like the Star Wars trilogy, but it's a series of 3 major reports that include a lot of detailed analysis and policy suggestions in this area that could be very interesting for people in all regions. I'd also like to make a plug for a report that we just published on Tuesday, the Economic Survey for Latin America and the Caribbean, which includes a thematic section on financing for development and some of the challenges for mobilizing domestic resources, which might fit into the topic of the series as well. Okay, well today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the redistributive impact of fiscal policies in Latin America. And I'd like to start by just providing a little bit of context for the work, touching a little bit on inequality and the current situation in the region, some of the motivations for our work, and in the interest of full transparency, say just a few words about methodology. And then I'd like to just pivot right directly into results that we've obtained from our studies. And then I'd like to talk just a little bit about some of the results that we've seen in some simple toy models, you might say, or some policy simulations that we've constructed to help us think a little bit about the design of fiscal policies and how we can get better leverage on reducing inequality. And then finally, I'll talk very shortly about the impact of public in-kind transfers, that is government expenditures, in this case in health and education, a topic that's very close to my heart, and I feel like it's an important area for future work. You could move to the next slide, please. As is pretty well documented, Latin America and the Caribbean is the most unequal region in the world when it comes to income distribution. And as can be seen in this figure, on average, the countries of the region are significantly more unequal than other developing regions, and not to mention the developed countries of the OECD. That said, it's important to highlight that in contrast with other regions, Latin America has experienced a significant decrease in inequality over the past decade. And between 2002 and 2011, 2012, of the 15 countries with information available, 14 of them registered a reduction in the Gini coefficient, which on average fell 1% per year, which resulted in a significant change. However, the latest data suggests that progress in this area may have slowed in recent years. Next slide, please. Part of that slowdown may be associated with the fact that the economic boom that the region has experienced in the last decade is coming quickly to an end, and economic growth has decelerated very quickly since rebounding after the economic and financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And ECLAC now estimates that the region's output will contract in 2016 by 0.8%, which is a greater fall than what was recorded in 2015 of 0.5%. At the same time, there's been a significant increase in fiscal constraints that have become apparent in quite a few of the region's countries, limiting their room to enact counter-cyclical policies. And as we can see here, the average fiscal deficit of the region's central governments in 2015 rose to 3% of GDP, which is greater than during the depths of the global economic crisis. Now, while public debt remains relatively low, it is also beginning to rise. So that creates immense challenges in terms of fiscal space. And so while the short-term picture that these graphs point to is very challenging, the medium-term forecast is also not necessarily conducive to increased fiscal space, because we may be entering into a period of longer period of low growth. Next slide, please. So given these challenges that I just outlined, we've asked ourselves, how can the region continue to reduce inequality? And of course, being fiscal policy analyst, of course, we thought that it would be important to evaluate the impact of taxes and monetary transfers on income distribution, get a better idea of what kind of leverage different instruments provided in reducing inequality. We really wanted to have results that we could compare across countries and also across regions, and specifically with the countries of the OECD. So we adopted a standardized methodology that would allow us to do that. And we also wanted to be able to build some sandboxes where we could play with the fiscal systems in the region so that we could ask some better questions about what the policy options were for Latin American countries. And finally, before I go on, I'd just like to also say that while the picture I'm about to paint of Latin America is of relatively low impact on inequality fiscal policies, our aim here is not to be a critique of the countries of the region. Mainly it's to highlight the current state of play and to try to generate questions, ideas, and proposals to really make fiscal policies in the region more redistributive. Next slide, please. Really just a few words on methodology. We used a very standard fiscal incidence model with an income classification scheme that we adopted from the OECD that you can see on the right. We modeled direct taxes on the laws that were in force and the year that we were modeling based on one major assumption, and that was that workers in the informal sector didn't pay direct taxes. That's a big assumption, but it's one that's made in many studies. The source of the information for our work was the latest available household survey for the countries in the region. Of course, this brings a number of challenges. As some of you who have worked with household surveys probably know, they're typically not representative of people with very high incomes. There's usually some underreporting of income, more so for some sources of income than others. And there are other typical problems with surveys such as missing responses or non-response. Fortunately for us, our work was made a little bit easier by the fact that ECLAC's statistics division is a regional leader in the analysis of household surveys. And so we received information from them that was processed for non-response and was also corrected for underreporting of income. Next slide, please. So to begin with, studies of OECD countries normally suggest that direct taxes and monetary transfers do serve to decrease inequality. And indeed, there are relatively few countries in this group where these instruments don't have a significant impact. Among the few, we can highlight in this graph here Chile and Korea, though I would point out in the later case the initial distribution of income is much, much more equal. A key finding that arises from the studies of OECD countries is that countries with a more unequal initial distribution tend to have a greater redistribution through fiscal policies, hence the upward slant of this line. Now, next slide, please. Now, in Latin American countries, in contrast, fiscal policies in general have relatively little impact on income inequality. On average, the Gini coefficient falls just 3 points, from 0.50 to 0.47 for the 16 countries considered here. And another thing that I'd like to highlight is that, as you can see in this graph, on average, the countries of the OECD and the EU15 have an initial distribution of income that is just as unequal as that seen in the region. But as we saw in the previous graph, they achieve a much more dramatic reduction in inequality through fiscal policies. Unsurprisingly, there are significant differences among the region's countries. On the one hand, there are countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, where the personal income tax, social security contributions, and monetary transfers reduce inequality, as measured by the Gini in this graph, around 13% on average. On the other hand, in Colombia, El Salvador, Paraguay, and the Dominican Republic, there is very limited redistribution, with a reduction on average of less than 2%. And additionally, with the exception of El Salvador, these countries are among those with some of the highest levels of income inequality. And we would expect, following the experience of OECD countries, to see fiscal policies play a greater role. Before leaving this slide, I would just also like to point out something that we tend to gloss over when we look at this data, and that is that on average, the region's citizens live with a level of income inequality that is relatively unimaginable for citizens in OECD countries. So just something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Now, when we dig a little deeper into the results, we see that public pensions are typically the monetary transfer that have the greatest redistributive power, even more so than direct taxes themselves. And this is largely in line with the results that we see in OECD countries. Just to give some context, OECD countries achieve a reduction in inequality of 17 Gini points through direct taxes and monetary transfers. And so I couldn't add a bar for that group of countries because it would make everything else so much smaller here, just for some additional context. With regards to the redistributive impact of cash transfers, there are really a number of factors at play that need to be taken into account. Most important of these are there public cash transfers, the existence of programs. In some countries of the region, there's private provision of pensions, for example, through mandatory accounts. Another key factor is the effective size of a cash transfer program in terms of budget. A program may have a very small budget and have a very big impact on another indicator, but it typically won't have a big impact in terms of income redistribution. And another issue is the coverage of programs in terms of population served. As we see in some cases, public pensions actually serve to increase inequality in some countries. I'd just like to say, before I move on here, that the red sections of these bars that you see in this graph also include many of the conditional cash transfer programs that have been so important in the region in reducing poverty. Their relatively small budgets largely preclude them from being significant agents of income redistribution, but their impact must be acknowledged nonetheless. Next slide, please. Turning to the personal income tax, our work shows that it has a relatively meager redistributive impact in the region. In the graphic on the left, we see in blue the reduction in the Gini due to the tax, which on average only serves to reduce inequality by 2%. The average effective tax rate is very low, and this reflects many structural weaknesses in the region's tax systems, including relatively low top marginal rates, high exempt income, numerous tax expenditures, as well as rampant tax evasion, which is a key issue in the region. And that's especially linked to the outsized role of the informal sector in our economies. And we can see this very low effective tax rate when we compare the region's countries with, for example, countries of the European Union, where the effective tax rate is much higher, especially for the richest decile, and the reduction achieved in the Gini by the tax is much greater. 12% decline on average. Next slide, please. So mindful of some of these weaknesses and interested to know a little bit more about what a stronger personal income tax might look like in the region, we decided to carry out some different scenarios. Now these are all very simplistic scenarios. They don't take into account second round effects, and I won't fully detail each of them here in the interest of time, but they're all very suggestive of the potential of transforming the personal income tax in the region into something more redistributive. Of the scenarios here, I would just like to point out, for example, the third scenario, scenario 3, where we took a standardized personal income tax in terms of brackets based on GDP per capita and used the same marginal tax rates for all countries. And with that, even allowing for high levels of tax evasion, this scenario was still able to increase the effective tax rate significantly from the relatively low rate in the actual baseline. We also tried a few scenarios that were inspired in part by recent tax reforms in the region, where the aim was to increase the effective tax rate for the highest decile to around 20%, which is something that we see in EU countries, to see just how much redistributive power we could obtain. And you can see some of the results here. Next slide, please. Now, like anybody who is given a new toy, we decided to take it a step further, and we wanted to see what would happen if we used these additional revenues that came from a stronger personal income tax to finance a monetary transfer. And to keep things simple, because we were doing this with many countries, we decided to just equally divide the additional revenue among the people in the first 3 deciles of the income distribution. Now you can imagine many different monetary transfers, but this was just a simple one to see what we could get. And as you can see in this graph, the use of the additional revenues is arguably where things get more interesting. And we can see that in the later 3 scenarios, all of which generated significant new revenues, the redistributive impact of the strength in personal income tax was important, but that we got a much stronger reduction in inequality after we started using the resources to finance a monetary transfer. Now, of course, you can't have one without the other, so this is important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Now, like I mentioned before, these simulations are simplistic, but they're not based on idle speculation. Over the past few years, a number of countries in the region have adopted tax and fiscal reforms that have included the reduction of inequality as a key objective. Of these, I would perhaps highlight Chile's reform of 2014, which called for, and I quote, advancing in tax equity, improving the distribution of income with the aim to permit the country to advance in a context of social and economic and political stability. There was also an important reform in Mexico in 2013 that had one of its key objectives as improve equality, eliminate privileges, and establish taxes to achieve a system that is more just, progressive, and equitable. And at the same time, a number of these reforms have also included specific public spending plans that espouse the reduction of inequality as well. And these have included commitments to public services and also to social protection, especially in the form of pension reform. I would just highlight that in the case of Chile, the tax reform was seen as a first step in making reform of the education system possible. In Mexico, one of the objectives of the reform included the establishment of universal social security for all Mexicans over 65 years old and unemployment insurance for workers who lose their jobs. And so in the region there's been much talk about, and ECLEC has certainly been at the forefront of pushing this, encouraging virtuous cycles of something we call reciprocity between citizens and their governments, with the first paying higher taxes, in turn for the second providing high-quality public services. And now, public services is a much larger concept than just monetary transfers alone. And so to get some more, to dwell a little bit more on this, we decided that we would also examine the impact of in-kind public transfers on income inequality. So that is transfers in services and not so much in terms of money. Next slide, please. Our work for the countries of the region found that public services, in this case health and education, appear to have a very significant redistributive impact. And in some cases, in some countries, this impact is even greater than the average achieved in OECD countries for these types of expenditures. Now, just a short aside, talking about this particular slide, I would say that this was by far the most difficult part of our study. It was the most time-consuming. Getting data on all public expenditures at all levels, central government, state government, local government, in these areas was not an easy task. And fiscal transparency remains a key challenge in the region. While the lack of statistics, financial information, as well as operating statistics, makes it difficult for analysts like ourselves to examine these issues, it makes it even harder for the region's citizens to hold their governments to account. And so this is an area that will need significant work in the future. And I'd also like to highlight, though, the excellent work of UNESCO in this area in pushing countries, not just in the region but around the world, to publish harmonized educational statistics. And their work made it much easier for us to uncover the data that we needed for educational spending. Next slide, please. That digression aside, we can see here in this slide that in-kind transfers in general have a much greater impact than monetary transfers and direct taxes. And they're much more apparent across the breadth of the region, including in countries where direct taxes and monetary transfers have relatively little impact on inequality. One case I would highlight, for example, is Colombia, where in-kind transfers have a very significant impact compared to other fiscal policies. Now, of course, there's significant differences across the region by country, but in a large part that's due to the different sizes of education and health budgets. But all that said, I would like to highlight that when we peel back the figures and we look a little bit deeper at the results, we see that a lot of the redistributive power derives from the fact that after the first couple of deciles, a large majority of individuals opt out of public services. This is especially apparent in educational services. It's especially true here in Chile, where it appears that many people with the means to send their children to private educational institutions do so. And so it scores a very significant challenge in fostering greater reciprocity in terms of paying taxes for public services. If many people have already opted out of public services, how do you bring them back into the fold, as it were, and get them to pay more taxes? And this will be a key challenge for the countries of the region in the coming years, and one where ECLAC will continue to do more work in the future. Next slide, please. So just a couple final thoughts. Despite the reforms adopted in the last decade in the region, and there have been many, our study clearly shows that the redistributive power of fiscal policies remains limited. In particular, the effect of personal income tax is quite a bit less than among OECD countries. And the different simulations, our toy models, show that the potential for reforms to make progress in the area is great. And so this is an area for domestic resource mobilization to really focus on. The results also reveal that the instrument in the region that currently has the greatest influence on inequality is public in-kind transfers in education and health. But when we take into account the fact that the quality of these services may be less than we would desire, we might want to think of these results in quality-adjusted terms, and so their impact may be less than what the figures actually are showing us. Next slide, please. The pronounced slowdown in economic growth and the macroeconomic situation that currently confronts the region is going to definitely complicate measures in this area in the coming years. But that said, the governments of the region have committed themselves in the post-2015 agenda, the 2030 agenda, to making significant gains in terms of quality public education, universal health care, and pensions. So there will be some strong demands on governments during this period. And so from the point of view of ECLAC, and something that we've stressed for many years, is that there's definitely a need to create social pacts for equality and to take a really holistic view of sustainable development policy making. From the standpoint of fiscal policy, and to what I can speak to, that really says taking the view that revenue and expenditure measures are mutually reinforcing to some extent, and to look to find ways where we can create these virtuous cycles of reciprocity. There are no easy answers to this, to the issues that are raised by this study, but hopefully this work has provided some insights and created some interest in how we can advance in the region. And with that, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. So now we're moving to Rodrigo's presentation, but before that, I would just like to remind everyone to send your questions via the questions pane or the chat application. Rodrigo.
Okay. Thank you, Raquel. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, the IPC team. Everybody's working on it. To the HelpAge, and also the socialprotection.org. You're part of it. I'll just do some comments on his presentation, also his paper. I admit that I'm a big fan of the ECLAC work. They are a regional leader. They have been not just about the trilogy for equality. This paper, I read it. I actually cited in my works the paper. I recently see from them the Time for Tax for Inclusive Growth together with Oxfam. So it's a great pleasure to talk about this paper and also to point out some aspects of it. So I'll just make some comments, general comments on it. Michael begins with 3 challenges. I'll just comment on that. The first one he says is that, okay, in Latin America, inequality has decreased during the last years, but it's still extremely unequal region of the world. About the falling of inequality, recently here in research, there are many new data from, it has to do about this Piketty discussion, Thomas Piketty in France, doing like a worldwide research on income distribution based on tax data. What is good about this tax data is that they're showing they are more precise information for the top incomes. And recently, the tax data in Brazil and some of the other countries, they're showing that at the top of the income distribution, let's say for the very, very rich, inequality hasn't reduced. Okay, let's say, and let's talk about another thing, is that top incomes in Brazil and many of the other Latin American countries has not decreased in the top. What happens is that in the bottom, the poor people gained more and the middle one less. So we're talking about a phenomenon that's the poor got more money, the middle ones lose, but the rich is still rich and hasn't fallen during the last years, even after the crisis. This is important about taxing because he talks a lot about the potential of taking more tax from the income tax. I'll be back to that later. Second point, challenge he gets is that economic growth has decelerated. And the third one is that fiscal constraints will be increasing in the next years. So taking all the three together is to say rich people in Latin America pay few taxes. Two, the inequality that has reduced has a lot to do with fiscal policy, but not about taxing the rich. There's a potential there. And there is our potential for the fiscal constraints. His works do a lot of parallel with the OECD countries. And this is important because the discussion there is about inequality in the top, also raised there. In Brazil, it's kept the same anyway. Latin America, I'm not sure if it's raised, but what is important to notice is that in most of the OECD countries, the top incomes inequality raised during the last decade, actually during most of the 21st century, as have been shown, the Thomas Piketty discussions and all that. And what they are doing now is that they are changing, they are reforming their tax systems to tax more the rich people and the poverty income. Why is that? First, it has to do with fiscal consolidation. They are also facing fiscal constraints. But more than that, economic theory, political theory, they are changing the views to taxing. One thing that they talk about in the article, the Clark team, Michael Hani and Ricardo Martinez and Andrea Podesta, is that for many years, people has told us that taxing has not to have a role of redistribution. All the tax must do is be efficient, not really about inequality, not really about redistribution. The redistributive role must be done from transfers, from not from taxing, but from expenditures. And now everybody has come a new debate about saying, no, we're wrong. There's a lot of things to do. Taxing must have a role on inequality. And one of the point of that is to reduce pressures from expenditures. So this one just a kind of a discussion that I would like to bring. It has a lot to do with his work. And the greatest challenge, what's the three challenges, but it has to do one objective, is how do we continue reducing inequality in the bottom of the distribution, Latin America, in this new world, a new world that has accelerated growth, that has more of fiscal constraints. And tax has a lot to do with that. Another kind of point, another kind of discussion I would like to bring is that he talks in his presentation, although it's not clear in the paper, we have a challenge here. Why is that? Okay, our tax system is very regressive, he shows that. Let's say rich people in Latin America do not pay, they pay very few taxes. The other point of it, when he talks about the transfers in kind, let's just say expenditures in public health and education, they are highly redistributive. Also is not, let's say, most of the benefits from health and education service are poor people. They are the ones that mainly benefit from the other transfers like conditionalities, cash transfers. That's to say the fiscal structure, the fiscal policy, it gives services from education and health to the poor. The poor also gets tax transfers, and they pay a lot of tax, as he shows there. The rich don't get this kind of service, but they almost don't pay taxes. And then you have the middle class, that as he said about Chile, but it's not just about Chile, also about Brazil, they have the feeling that they don't get the services, and they pay a lot of tax. And this is about culture, a fiscal culture. And he has a challenge there is how to bring these people to get service. And then you have one problem. I would like to point out is that when we're comparing with OECD countries, you're saying, okay, in Latin America we have 20% of GDP in taxes. 20% of GDP, and say, well, this must be 20% of the GDP to public services. The problem is that the per capita GDP here, sometimes 1/4 of the per capita GDP in OECD countries. That means that you have 1/4, let's say, there they will have 4 times more resource available for public services. So even that we tax the same amount that they do, we still have much less resource available per capita to get quality services. So even taxing the same proportional to the income, proportional to the GDP, will be under-financed, will not be able to get the same amount, to get the same quality, the same amount of resource, and probably the same quality of public resources. So this is an issue about culture that is, it brings there is different. Let's say middle class, let's say we pay too much taxes and we get the same services that they get in Germany, in the United States, or in England, or whatever, OECD countries. It's impossible. We don't have the same amount. And that's a culture that we got to do, how to strengthen that, how to bring social cohesion, whatever. Anyway. Another thing that is very important at the point is that, okay, seeing the whole fiscal policy role and redistributed role, just 1/3 of the redistributed role has to do with personal income tax. Let's say our personal income tax is very regressive. Let's say it's very low progressive, has a low progressive role. And actually say about all the tax in Latin American countries, usually they are regressive because they're based in indirect tax that poor people pay more. And when talking specifically about personal income tax, it's maybe the highest problem there, that they're not just talking about the marginal tax, let's say the taxes that we pay here is very low, but they're saying we have 2 main problems. The first, we have large-scale tax avoidance and evasion. Why is that? It has to do with informality. We not have the same. It's very difficult to think that no OECD country will be the same like Latin America country because we have a higher informality there. It's normal that we have more avoidance and etc. But the second problem has to do with tax culture and a higher degree of distrust. This is a kind of culture that we must deal, we must bring on there. And another part, very important, that they discuss is that we have structural deficiencies in the tax code. We have too many tax expenditures, and we have too many exempt income levels. This to give, and this has to do, bring it back again, for a long period, they used to tell that personal income tax should be reduced, and we should give many benefits to capital income. An example is here in Brazil. In Brazil, we have dividends that is distributed for rich people mainly. They are tax-free. One of the consequences of that is that very rich people in Brazil, 2/3 of their income comes from dividends, and they are tax-free. The result of this is that very rich people in Brazil, they pay very low rates on their effective income. And that has to do because we have many exemptions and many benefits to capital incomes, to financial applications incomes, to capital gains, and etc. And that's an important part that he is dealing in this paper. Because we usually, when we're talking about progressivity of the personal income tax, people are talking about the rates. Okay, we got higher top income rate, etc. he brings another discussion, which I think is the most important right now, is about tax exemption for capital incomes. And this also has to do with historical trends. Since this Piketty discussion and many of the other discussions that are going to in the OECD countries, we're talking about let's change this. There's a lot of road that rich people can do. And this has to do about revision of tax exemptions in the personal income tax. I think I got all my time, right? So I just want to point some things and thank for the opportunity, and also thanks for Hani and Ricardo Martini and Eco Podesta and the whole ECLAC team that are doing a great job bringing the discussions for our countries, which is a great experience also for other parts of the world. Just to say, it's not Latin America that is discussing the redistributive role of the fiscal policy. It's many, many other countries, even OECD countries, that are talking about that, because usually fiscal adjustments tend to penalize more the poor. So how do we do kind of a fiscal adjustment, not, let's say, not destroying our fiscality that's towards to reduce inequality? And thank you for the opportunity.
So now we're moving to the questions and answers session, but before that I would just like to call again Daniel, who has a point he would like to make as well for this session.
Yes, thank you. Hello. And Michael, great presentation. Rodrigo as well. I was quite impressed by the playing around, as it were, with the taxes. I'd like to make a good point that came out in one of the slides that Michael presented, and it's something that I believe some years ago Santiago Levy also pointed out, that the types of taxes we have and transfers usually need to be seen as working together. In terms that we have to look at both consumption and income side instruments. But one of the things that struck me and I wanted to mention and bring to the audience was that if you look at, I think it was the slide on the redistributive effect of the different instruments and pensions included, is one thing you'll see is that Brazil ranks pretty high with the public pensions in terms of reducing Gini income inequality. And it's interesting to note that Brazil has one of the higher benefit levels for public pensions and one of the more liberal targeting schemes. I think it's 33% of GDP per capita is the benefit level, and less means tested. In fact, I don't believe it's means tested. To the degree that, say, on the other end of the spectrum, Colombia has a very means and regionally targeted scheme and a benefit level of about 5% of GDP per capita. And I think that these distributive effects of the benefits work together with the tax system. And it's good to see that research is finally looking at both sides of the debate. And that's really all I wanted to bring up, and I look forward to hearing other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So now some questions that came from our audience. There were a lot of questions. We won't unfortunately be able to answer them all live, but we will address them later on at the online community, Fiscal Space for Social Protection. So first, a question regarding the how can the gains of the redistributed effect be sustained in a situation where revenue is on a decline due to the low economic growth globally and possible high public debt for some countries? There were also other questions related to the informal sector, which is really important for developing countries. And how to measure then their effect on inequality, and what is the relation between the Gini coefficient and tax revenue. Finally, There was also a question related to whether the middle class being highly taxed is a trend found only in middle and low-income countries, and what would be the motivating factor behind it. So I'll give the floor first to Michael and then Rodrigo. So Michael, please.
Thank you, Raquel. I will try to answer these very interesting questions. The first one about how can we maintain a redistributive effect given the economic situation that we're in. I would argue that while the economic situation is difficult and it will create challenges, it also creates opportunities. And now is a good time to potentially think of tax reforms, and not just raising more revenue with a view to 2030, for example, but how do we raise that revenue? And so I think that's the moment for us to come into the debate and suggest that we can look to the personal income tax. And as Rodrigo mentioned, there are a lot of other taxes that would be interesting to look at. For example, property taxes and taxes on capital income. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities. It's a difficult situation, but it will take some political courage, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, to make progress there. There was some questions about informality. That informality is a very key issue for the region. Many of our economies are highly informal. When we do this kind of analysis, it's very difficult to handle the informal sector. So we have to make very large assumptions. And the assumptions that we make are, for example, that the informal sector doesn't pay any taxes at all. And that's not necessarily true. As has been raised in some of the other comments, consumption taxes are paid by everyone for the most part. There is some evasion of those taxes, but the poor, even in the informal sector, pay consumption taxes. So our work there is incomplete, mainly for the lack of having data to be able to make good estimates. There was a question about the link between tax revenue and the Gini coefficient. And typically the tax system, if it's designed with brackets that increase with higher tax rates, you're going to have a progressive system. And so if you just increase the amount of tax that people have to pay, so the tax revenue goes up using that same progressive system, that typically will give you a decrease in the Gini coefficient. Of course, there's a lot of other factors that could play into that. And finally, there was a very interesting point about the middle class and the middle class paying taxes. Now, in our study, I didn't show a slide here, but we found that in many countries in the region, nearly the entire personal income tax is carried by the richest decile. Something upwards of 90% of the personal income tax is paid by the top decile. There are a few countries where that's not the case, where the middle class also pays personal income tax, but that's rare. And one of the issues with expanding the personal income tax and making it stronger is bringing the middle class into the tax. And that's where this issue of reciprocity and how can we get people to trust public institutions and be willing to pay more taxes and at the same time consume public services instead of going to the private sector. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And now we give the floor to Rodrigo.
Okay, just some quick points commenting here. Yes, the challenge is debt is growth, and it might need a fiscal adjustment in many of our countries. Actually, first of all, debt growth is not necessarily bad. It's bad when it's growing for several years. This might bring a bread. You know, let's say 1 or 2 years that you're facing a depression. It's normal that the debt grows, and as the economic conditions get better, it will follow anyway. The problem is that when it's growing too fast for a long period, that brings a problem and demands a fiscal adjustment. And the fiscal adjustment could be in different forms. It could be by reducing expenditures and also by raising taxes. Reducing expenditures, if we want to keep our countries nice and equal with one social cohesion, we should get privilege to those to reduce expenditures that do not punish the poor ones, that depend more on tax transfers, that depend more on public service, that depend more on health services. So fiscal adjustment must keep this in mind, first of all. You have many ways to reduce expenditures, not punishing the ones that need more, the poorest ones. And also you can raise revenues, not punish the ones that are poorer. This means taxing more the richer or even the middle class. This means taxing more the personal income tax, taxing more the property tax, and taxing more inheritance taxes and all these kind of ones that usually don't have much of the incidence in the poor. So this is how to maintain revenues declining. Okay, we can just work both sides, both tax and expenditure side. About the informal sector, I think Michael is great. I don't have anything to complement. On the third question about Gini coefficients and how tax affects the Gini coefficient, it's just as he shows there. We have to think about your income. You have like two kinds of income: the ones before and after tax, and you have two kinds of tax, as he shows. The direct tax and the indirect ones. Which ones are the direct taxes? For example, the personal income tax. Personal income tax is very highly concentrated on the top 10% richest, and especially on the 5% richest in the country like Brazil. Most of the people don't pay personal income tax because they are exempt, they are too poor. Just the richer ones pay that. But what is important that recent research has shown is that, yes, personal income tax is mainly the 5% richest of the country. But when we start to go very high in the income distribution, the top 0.1%, they pay less than the middle class, than the other ones. You know, they pay less because there are many exemptions to capital income. But anyway, the personal income tax has an effect of reducing inequality because it's very concentrated on the top ones of the income distribution. Also the property taxes and etc. By the other side, indirect tax, that is these mainly in the value-added tax, for example, they do not differentiate people from their income. When you go to a market and you buy a product, a good, I don't know, an orange, you're paying taxes. And this doesn't differentiate if you are poor or if you're rich. And usually those who consume more from their income, they pay more indirect tax. This is usually poor people pay more indirect tax. Why our tax system are bad, as he shows, is that we tax too much indirect tax. That usually the poor people pays more than direct tax. So this is the main relation, okay? And this is why also related to the fourth question that about middle class and middle income countries, is that our tax system relies too much on indirect tax. And that's why poor people pay too much taxes, and that's why rich middle class people pay too much tax, and very rich ones do not pay that. So does that have to do to a middle income class, middle income country? Not necessarily, but in Latin America specifically, we have a lot of opposition about taxing, of direct tax, also not just the personal income tax, that we have many benefits to capital income, but also to property tax. So I will not say that the relation is that middle class and middle income countries, but also a culture that we have, that we many oppositions about taxing capital income and property income. I think I was made my point.
Thank you. Thank you, Rodrigo, and thank you, Michael, thank you, Daniel, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. Again, would like to remind everyone to join the socialprotection.org platform and the Fiscal Space for Social Protection online community to stay up to date on the series. And also would like to invite everyone to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar in order to receive feedback and be able to improve the next webinars in the series. Thank you, everyone, and this is then the end of our webinar.